All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Association of College and Research Libraries Science and Technology section, Government Information Committee's annual update. That's quite the mouthful. I apologize for that. My name is Erin Thomas. My pronouns are she, her, or they. I'm a science and engineering librarian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also the co-chair of the Government Information Committee. With me today are two presenters who will be speaking on separate topics that hopefully will be of interest, as well as Dan Broadbent, who is a fellow Government Information Committee member who will be helping to field and answer questions. Our session today is live captioned and is being recorded. The recording will be uploaded to YouTube at some point in the future. Please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat as our speakers are presenting, or hold them until the end of the session when we will have time for Q&A. Today's session title is AAAS and the Science Family Journals, Advocating for Government Budget Transparency in Science and Technology and Open Science to Support Reproducibility. We have two speakers here from AAAS and Science. Alessandra Zimmerman is a writer and analyst for the R&D Budget and Policy Program of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, where she collects information on federal science spending, both current and past. Previously, she was the executive director at Proposal Analytics, performing research into making the research funding space more useful to early career researchers. She has also been a program manager for the Canadian Science Policy Center, an intern at AAAS's EPI Center, and a researcher for the National Science Policy Network. Prior to switching to science policy work, she earned her PhD in biochemistry from the University of Maryland and has a BS in chemistry from Carnegie Mellon University. Megan Phelan is the executive director of the Science Press Package Team, where she oversees efforts to boost the visibility of all forthcoming science family of journals content for reporters worldwide. Prior to joining AAAS in 2013, she served as a senior writer at AIR Worldwide, where she interacted with more than 65 PhD-level scientists and engineers to communicate advances in wind engineering, seismology, climate science, and other fields. Previously, she was a senior writer and editor at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Megan holds a bachelor's degree in biology and Spanish from Gettysburg College and a master's degree in science writing from the Johns Hopkins University. In 2008, Megan received a Fulbright scholarship to work with Dr. Juan Antonio Raga at the University of Valencia to help determine the cause of morbillivirus resurgence among small cetaceans in the Mediterranean. Megan also completed science reporting internships with Science as well as National Public Radio and has freelanced for various outlets, including Anesthesiology News. So, having said all of that, I'm going to hand this over to Alessandra, who is our first presenter. Take it away, Alessandra.
Thank you. You guys got my entire career and only a sampling of Megan's, just to show some lead up to the amazing talk that's going to follow. But I am going to start my talk by discussing the R&D budget and policy program and the data that we curate. So we are a program of one. So I am currently in charge of generating all of the data, but it's always been the case. We've always been one person in charge of tracking the entire federal government's R&D. And we've existed for the past almost 50 years. We were created as a program in 1976. And since then, whoever has been in charge of the program tracks funding from its inception as the presidential budget request, which comes out in usually early spring, all the way through the entire appropriations process until it's signed into law every year, so that we have not only the final numbers that are generated, but also numbers throughout the process, how the budget evolves. And we have that data for the past 47 years. But beyond extracting and compiling the R&D data. We also do a lot of work explaining the budget process because it's not exactly the most obvious system. For example, I believe today's committee markup of the Agriculture Subcommittee bill is still ongoing. It started at 10 a.m. And there are 12 of these in each chamber. It's a very complicated process with lots of back and forth. So we act as the translators for this system. I have a lot of explanatory documents on my website that break down the process into smaller, more digestible bits. And I do a lot of talks like this one for groups to explain to whoever is interested how funding happens at the federal level. But the reason I was invited is our archive of budgetary data, because we don't just get all this data and then sit on it or toss it somewhere. We have actually, behind me I have all of the reports for the past, that's 40 or so years. We stopped doing physical copies a little while ago, but it used to be a 300-page booklet generated every year. This is the one from the year I was born, to either age myself or de-age myself, depending on where you stand. That had every single number in the entire federal program. And we still do that. We just do it online now and a little bit more up to date, because instead of publishing it once a year, we're publishing it the moment the numbers change. So I was actually this morning updating the dashboards. And then the last thing my program does is report on not just the numbers, but what they mean. So I write basically blogs explaining what the cuts mean to the agencies, where those cuts are. When we had the debt ceiling discussions, there was a lot of how those negotiations were going to impact R&D on the long term, a lot of prediction modeling. So I also do some prognosticating, though not editorializing, of the numbers. So normally when I start my talks, I do a show of hands of who knows what discretionary versus mandatory means, or authorization versus appropriation, because there's a lot of language involved in all of this data, but there's also a lot of just kind of visuals. So here is R&D funding since we started tracking it in the US. So we have in black total R&D. You can see that it's been going up. And it's mostly been in research and development. Facilities costs have not significantly increased over time. When we look at it a different way, as a percentage of GDP, federal R&D has been going down the entire time, or almost the entire time that we've been tracking it. So one of the reasons my program exists is because there are multiple ways to look at R&D data. It's not just one item. So what we end up doing is I have these historical databases that I maintain on my website. There is in total, I think 64, 65 different analyses that I maintain that are available just for public download. We have both the charts that you just saw, so all the PNGs are just downloadable images of the charts, as well as the raw data. It is curated, it's not completely raw, downloadable as Excel files for people who want to look at the data, interpret it in various ways. Those people are frequently reporters or policy researchers, though there are the occasional other who has a need for longitudinal R&D data. So I maintain all of these every fall, while the appropriations committees argue whether or not to shut down the government. I spend my time updating all of these with the latest numbers, and then I'm good for another year until I need to go through and update all 65 again. But this is our biggest collection of data. It extends the furthest. Not every single data set goes back to the same date. You'll see some go back to 1976, some go back to 1953. Nothing really goes back further than that, because it turns out that the United States didn't really have a strong R&D infrastructure prior to the 50s. So there's nothing to track further back. But we do our best to track as many interesting data sets as possible. But if you or someone that asks you for knowledge of data sets ever needs something that is not present on these, I also have a lot of less pretty Excel files that contain other data that I'm more than happy to share. I just don't post them publicly because they are not nearly as clean. But hopefully all of this is useful information for you or whoever you help find data for. But we also have a lot of tracking of data that is a little bit more active. So this is actually the dashboard I was updating this morning that tracks the appropriation cycle as it occurs. So every time the committees do any action on the appropriations bills, I update these to reflect what the current state of funding is. They are usually accurate within about a day. On occasion, the appropriations committees will decide to drop 6 bills at once, and in which case these will not be accurate to the day because it takes me a certain amount of time to process the bills. But I do my best to try to keep up with the bills as fast as possible. And then I also track several other spending tools that are not part of the appropriation cycle, or at least not what you think of when you think of the appropriation cycle. Technically, earmarks, or as they've been rebranded, community funded projects, are within the appropriations bills, but they are not typical federal funding. So we have a separate dashboard for those. And since the appropriation cycle just started in Congress, we're actually going to create the FY 2024 portal very soon and have all of those. What we do here is, because we are specifically an R&D budget and policy program, we look at through all of the earmarks that are posted. So this year it's 5,068, I believe, out of the House. And identify all the ones that are STEM related. So either have a STEM education component, R&D, research workforce development, or explicitly R&D themselves, or anything like that. We remove those from the mass, and then we add them to this portal where you can look at them by district to see who in your area is attempting to fund a community project related to STEM. We also have project categories that include things like K-12 education, higher education, agriculture, environment, defense, all sorts of categories that these projects could fall into. And as the bills pass through, we'll also track if the value of the earmark changes through the various appropriations processes, or if it gets removed entirely, because earmarks are not guaranteed. The committees can vote them off or move to not include them. So we track the ones that get pushed to the final line. And then I'm sure you guys have been bombarded with this, but this last year we had some landmark bills. One of them being the CHIPS and Science Act, but we also had the Inflation Reduction Act, and the year before the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. All three of those had, outside of appropriations, science funding, as well as science authorizations. And one of the things that I do is I break down what exactly was authorized, which means promised, but not delivered. So the idea being they are now allowed to ask for that much money, but it's not necessarily theirs yet. They just have the right to request it or appropriate it, which means the money is directly going to be dispersed for that purpose. So I break down the authorizations versus appropriations in each of the bills, how much per year, what the purpose of each line item is, and then a couple analyses of how much is actually being spent on from the authorizations, how much is being spent in the next appropriation cycle, because an authorization is a ceiling, not a floor. They can go up to, but they rarely actually max out that number. So that very large NSF authorization that we saw in the CHIPS and Science Act is likely never going to be fully met. It is aspirational, and there will be funding below that level every year, especially now that we have a divided Congress and a House that is putting caps well below the negotiated amounts. So we're likely going to see much lower appropriations than we saw in the authorization of that bill. So these are kind of all the various items that I track. I am happy to provide raw data for any of them. And then obviously, to do so, you must be able to contact me. So I have here my email, my Twitter, and also my website, which all the links you saw below are linked on my website, as well as once this talk is over, I have a page on my website where I post all my presentation slides. So you don't need to be frantically screenshotting any of this. You can just go download the PowerPoint and click on the slides there. And then I'm gonna hand it over to the other side of AAAS's open science sharing data conversation, and Megan is going to talk to you about how science journals handle it.
Thanks, Alessandra. Great presentation. I so admire the work that you are doing, and I'm really happy to be here with everybody today. My name is Megan Phelan. Like Erin said in the opening, I'm the Executive Director of the Science Press Package. My team's main and first focus is to communicate new research from the journals to press. So, you might wonder why I'm here talking about open data standards. And it's because in recent years, journalists have become just as interested in open access, open data, open science as some of the research that we're publishing. So I've endeavored, by talking to our editors and our publisher and others, to become more conversant in it. I will present to you today 7 slides. I will try to answer any questions you have, but I do want to caveat up front that I may have to take some questions back to our editors who know the ins and outs of data repositories, but all questions are fair game. So next slide, please. Okay, so before I talk about what science has been doing and leading and really pioneering in the way of open data, I want to just take a moment to clarify open data, open science, Those terms are distinct from open access, which we hear a lot about, which is a business model. At the science family, we have one open access journal, one gold open access journal. It is Science Advances, a multidisciplinary journal. And then we have 5 paywall journals. Okay, so, but that's the business model piece of it. Today, I'm really talking about something different: open data and open science. Open data refers to the practice of authors making the data and code on which their conclusions rest permanently and publicly available. Okay, that's the data. And then open science refers to authors transparently reporting their experimental designs, methods, results, really laying out the way they did the study so that someone else could replicate, reanalyze it if they wish to. Both of these things are needed for research to be reproducible. That's really important to science, and to help independent readers, other scientists, policymakers, the public, assess the evidence base for a conclusion. We are deeply committed to open data and open science at the Science family of journals, where we have 1 open access journal and 5 subscription journals. Next slide. Okay, so I've come to understand that the Science family journals has really been a leader in making open data a mainstream practice, not just at our journals, but in the scientific publishing industry broadly. You know, it used to be not that many years ago that if you wanted data for a paper in a particular topic from many different journals, you'd have to go and broker that with the authors. The data wasn't available upon publication at the journal, in a repository, and or anywhere else. You had to go and broker that with the authors, and that could be time requisite and difficult. And there are, a number of reasons for that. Reasons that researchers are concerned about sharing their data, and we can talk about that in another slide. But science looked at this problem and wanted to be part of helping. And in 2014, our editor-in-chief at the time, Marcia McNutt, convened a group in Charlottesville, Virginia, which happens to be the home for the Center for Open Science. And these were journal editors, they were funders, they were researchers. She wanted to talk about how journals broadly around the world could be more committed to openness. And that includes data being open and available for replication. And that group put together something called Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines, or the TOP guidelines. Marcia actually coined the moniker herself. And the TOP guidelines were published in Science in 2015. So on the right hand of this screen, you can see a policy forum promoting open research culture. This is the policy forum that laid out the TOP guidelines as led by Marcia and various other stakeholders. That's 2015. Today, there are more than 5,000 journals who are signatories of TOP, who think that it paints a great picture for how to make research reproducible, including, as one facet, open data protocol. And for us, TOP meant a major change at the Science family journals. It meant, as we implemented TOP, authors could no longer provide data only upon request. They had to provide it at publication as a requirement to publish in a repository or in the supplemental file of a paper. And as you can imagine, their doing this at that time saved so much time downstream, where previously individuals would have had to work with authors, negotiate with them for data. Now the data was right there. So that was huge. Next slide. Okay. All right, so here are our requirements for data deposition at Science and the other family journals. So we require all data used in an analysis of a study to be available to any researcher for purposes of reproducing or extending the analysis. So this typically doesn't mean like raw data, like data in a field notebook, for example, but it's anything that was used in the analysis of a study. It has to be placed in a reliable repository, which either that's a subject-specific repository, a genomics repository, a protein structure repository, or in a more general repository like Dryad or Dataverse or Zenodo. And if it's not in a repository, for some reason an author doesn't have a repository they know and want to put their data in, they could put the data set in the paper's supplemental file. That's their backup option, but it has to be available. And by doing this since 2015, by requiring this since that time, we've really been ahead of competitors, believe it or not, on data requirements. This means we're ahead of even many open access journals, because maybe counterintuitively, many journals that are open access don't necessarily require the data to be open. So we're really focused on the data being open. On the right-hand side of this screen, you can see the title of a blog one of our editors wrote in 2020. This is a couple years into our having implemented TOP. He wanted to go back and look at how much of a change that had inspired in terms of how many authors were now depositing data in a repository, and what kinds of repositories versus in the supplemental file. If you go to the next slide, you can see a chart on the right here that highlights what we saw in 2020 for research papers submitted to Science in terms of repositories used. The percentages there add up to over 100 because some data sets were submitted to multiple repositories. But in that year, 2020, 3 years ago, 70% of the 748 research articles published in Science archived their data or code in an external repository. The remaining put the data in a paper's supplemental file. Next slide. So it takes a lot to maintain an open data system when you are a multidisciplinary journal publishing across disciplines. Each discipline has a preference about what repository it might like to use, if at all, and when to put their data in. There are a lot of distinctions there, and our editors have really tried to be sensitive to this in their implementation and maintenance of an open data system. It takes a lot of work and attention. So they discuss data release with authors for every paper prior to acceptance, and this situation looks different for every paper. Sometimes people ask us why we don't publish more industry affiliated papers, and that's because in a lot of cases, industry wouldn't be willing to deposit the data, so we can't publish. Or, if we really want to get something out there, we have to really work with them and get a select set of data enough to reproduce a paper available. So those are some of the kinds of negotiations that editors might take on in this space. They're actively engaging with the community to address obstacles around making data open. In some fields where researchers work really hard to get a data set, it's the result of a 7-year field expedition, and they're very worried about being scooped. The editors have found ways to kind of direct the data to the right repository. They've helped researchers understand how those data sets, once in the repository, will be cited so that the researchers can get credit for them and be acknowledged for them. And that is really important. And that's a game-changing facet of open data in the last few years. It's also possible that despite all our editors' best efforts, maybe some data isn't available the way it should be. So Science has set up, as I note in my third bullet here, a special email address that researchers or others can use. They can reach out to us if data they seek to reproduce a study isn't found. And this happens now and again. I can remember one case in my tenure, and I've been here 10 years, where data wasn't available the way that we thought it was and the editors thought it was, and someone pointed that out at this email address, and it ultimately led to us retracting the study. And this was because this prompted us to look a little more deeply into an issue, and it turns out there had been some fraud and misconduct, and the data wasn't even available. So this is another benefit of having this policy about open data. People looking in from the outside might spot things that can help us advance the science or correct the record if needed. Fortunately, that doesn't happen very often. I wanted to note the paper, the title for which you see on the right-hand side of the screen. It's called Early Dispersal of Domestic Horses into the Great Plains and Northern Rockies. And Science just published this paper this spring. And it was really a landmark for us in terms of data, because it captured the oral histories of various indigenous tribes, and that's not the kind of data set that usually is accommodated by supplemental files or repositories, but our editors worked quite diligently to ensure that research that reflected both findings from traditional Western academics and indigenous collaborators could be included, captured here. It received quite a lot of attention in the media. It's something we definitely want to do more of. Next slide. Okay, so to help the authors who are publishing with us make an easier thing of data deposition and to more broadly strengthen scientific reproducibility, just this year we've partnered with a nonprofit multidisciplinary data repository known as Dryad. Some of you may know it, and this is a really helpful thing for authors who maybe don't know what repository to go to because there isn't a field specific one for their field. They can take advantage of the way they can submit to Dryad immediately upon acceptance with Science Family Journals. Dryad curates their data. It creates persistent identifiers so that credit is given to anyone who uses the data sets. It lets researchers see how their data is cited and used in the future. And after implementing it just this spring, we've seen incredible excitement from the authors who are working with us. They want to go ahead and submit their data there. So we're very excited about our partnership with Dryad. And my last slide is just my contact information. I'm happy to answer any questions now in Q&A. Alessandra and I are happy to answer questions now or later. You can reach me at my email and follow me on Twitter. I try to tweet about open data and open science and open access. I'm increasingly interested in all of these topics, as I'm sure you are. Thank you. We'd be happy to take any questions you might have for us.
Looks like there's one question in the chat, and as we had discussed previously, I'll read them out loud to help of the question be recorded in the video for later access. So from Jody, the question is, having open data is great, but it can also be a band-aid, so to speak, on the greater problem of reproducibility. Do you require or have plans to require standards to the data, such as a minimum amount of metadata, or do you rely on repository requirements? This might be too difficult given the interdisciplinary nature of the complete suite of journals Sciences publishes.
That's a great question. I'm pulling up notes on something that we partnered to produce and we published in PNAS, Jody. I think it's called MDAR. I think it stands for minimum data. Let me just find it here. Okay, because this is worth finding. Thanks for your patience. Okay, the MDAR framework for transparent reporting in the life sciences. So MDAR stands for Materials Design Analysis Reporting. We published about this in PNAS in the last year or so. I'll put a link in the chat. And I think this framework, which our editors could speak to, they were instrumental in its development, does put standards on data and I think also as relates to metadata. So that's a start to answer your question. I could look into it more if you'd like with our editors.
We also assembled a few questions in advance that I can interject here as time allows. Maybe I'll pause for a minute more to see if other questions come from the live group, and then if not, I'll read our previously assembled questions. I guess we should say it's an open invitation to just unmute yourself and say your questions. You don't have to type them in the chat if you don't want to. Okay, looks like there's another question from Matthew. What happens when budget attempts fail and year is simply completed under a continuing resolution?
So I'm pretty sure that one's for me. So when an attempt to create a new budget fails, we either shut down or go into continuing resolution because they anticipated the failure to reach a resolution. And in this year in particular, because of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the debt limit negotiations that were signed into law, if we don't reach a conclusion on the 12 bills of the Appropriations Committee separately, they can't lump them all together and vote on them as one entity. They don't reach a conclusion and agreement on them separately, we automatically go into a CR with a 1% reduction in funding. And that's not typically how it goes. Normally they have to decide to initiate a CR. It doesn't kind of unroll itself on its own. But basically a CR is just a maintaining of the previous budget. You make no changes. You can, in the text that initiates the CR, make a couple amendments to it. Frequently, there'll be changes for Department of Defense or NASA that have a lot of longitudinal funding. So let's say NASA was just starting the development of a new rocket and knew that its next year was going to need a significant increase to allow it to continue developing it and not waste all the previous money. A CR might have a bit of a change to allow for that increased funding, just so that we don't waste all of the money that came before. And the Department of Defense will occasionally get additions because they need something, or else they're not going to be operational in some capacity and stuff like that. But typically CRs are just, we continue as we were. We ignore the impact of inflation. We ignore the impact of sustained growth models in a lot of the agencies. So a CR is normally kind of a little bit of a belt tightening, but not super large. And most years CRs are short. Most years CRs are on the order of months until they do eventually reach an agreement. With this divided Congress, many people are expecting CR to be the entire year. So it would be, yes, 1% yet less year over year for the whole year, instead of for a couple months until they reach an agreement on the new budget and then have the new numbers going. So it is kind of bad because a lot of agencies have a growth model. They expect increases and have planned those increases into their projects for years and years. But also on the fiscal responsibility side, we are as a nation in debt. So there is kind of like that push and pull around CRs, and they are the middle ground between making a move in either direction.
Thank you, Alessandra. Another question came in from Eric. This question might be a bit outside the scope of the presentations, but is there a correlation between book banning efforts and attempts to limit access to open data?
Interesting question. I think I can maybe speak to it adjacently by thinking about attempts to limit access to open data. So there's not much data that we as a publisher would not require to be open. So it might be some industry data that's proprietary, or data that's personally identifying, or it might be data that was bought from a third party to be used to do an analysis of a kind. So from our perspective, that's the only kind of data that we would say can be an exception and needn't be made open. I don't know how much of that data relates to book banning efforts and related discussions. It's an excellent question. I can share maybe tangentially related, an editorial that our editor-in-chief before our current editor-in-chief. Our current editor-in-chief is Holden Thorpe. Before him, Jeremy Berg was an editor-in-chief, and he published an editorial that I'll put in the chat. He talked about how there was a new proposal by the Environmental Protection Agency to eliminate the use of publications in policy discussions where all underlying data was not publicly available. This is kind of the flip side of your question, I think, Eric. His editorial makes the point that, in fact, some of the research where all the data wasn't made publicly available still was peer-reviewed and vetted and should be considered in policy discussions. So we were kind of arguing from the opposite side of your question. Even though the data wasn't completely open, maybe there were personal identifiers in it. Maybe it was data about pollution and health, let's say, where EPA would say that data should not be part of policy. We would advocate that it should be if it was peer-reviewed and vetted. So I know this doesn't directly answer to your question, but it's the best I've got, and now I'm going to research this topic.
Well, thank you, Megan. Yeah, good information and good question. We'll all draw from one of our previously assembled questions. How can academic librarians support the collaboration between AAAS, Science, and Dryad? Do you think providing outreach and instruction around Dryad and other data repositories is enough?
Yes, well, let's see. So I'm going to share the release that we put out around our partnership with Dryad, and it would be wonderful if you would share this with your investigators at your universities who wonder about how to comply with open data standards. It could let them know that if they're publishing in any of the science family journals, there's automatically going to be an option for them to put their data in Dryad, which is open to data of all disciplines and varieties. I think just helping them understand that open data is a priority at science. Every editor discusses it with every author group, and that we have an automatic way for them to leverage a repository that does a great job citing data and tracking citations, downloads, and uses would be wonderful. Thanks really for the question and sharing our write-up on it with your investigators, your researchers.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. The Dryad now accepts data from all areas of science and engineering. I think it's so. One of the reasons I understood we partnered with Dryad was because it could be a home for data types that didn't have a good fit elsewhere. Now, it might mean that some data types are excluded. I know that Dryad looks at data to make sure it's usable and has very high standards. So perhaps there are some data types that don't quite meet the threshold. But as far as I know, we partnered with them because they could be a home to quite a variety of data types.
I'll draw from one of our other previously assembled questions. Can you elaborate on ways that you've worked with librarians and educators on accessing and reviewing the publicly available dashboards? Is this a request you often receive, or do you find that these dashboards and reports are less well known?
Based on my website analytics, people who use my dashboards used to use them from bookmarked pages. So it's really people who know the dashboards use the dashboards. So that's one of the big things I'm hoping to change since I've taken over the program, is make them a lot more user-friendly, for one. If anyone has commentary on the usability of the dashboards, I would love to hear it, because I do intend on redesigning them at some point to be a little bit more user-friendly. But also, people don't really know about the dashboards unless they've heard me talk or heard me talk at them about the data. So one of the things is I do want to let people know that it is available publicly, and that I am happy to explain anything about the data, because some of it is not super intuitive at the beginning, because people may come into this from outside the policy sphere, outside the people who live and breathe the budget, but need budgetary data to prove a point. And that is probably the majority of my users, people who don't exist in policy at all times, but let's say their program at NSF is currently facing a budget cut. So they want to see the history of funding within the NSF to defend the idea that their program should not get cut. Or they want to make an analysis of the life science research in the life sciences across the past however many years. And that's primarily the users of my data. They come to me for one specific thing. I explain as much context as they need around the data. And then most of the times I don't necessarily see them again. But I am very thankful for my repeat users. I do know a lot of them by name now, because we communicate a lot if you need my data on a frequent basis.
Well, this is giving me an idea for an action item that I'm going to take from this meeting, which is I maintain several research guides, LibGuides on the university library site where I work. I think I'm going to add some of the dashboard links.
That would be amazing. Thank you.
Well, then one last previously assembled question. How do you envision science librarians can help advocate for government budget transparency when it comes to science-related issues?
Well, one of the things is knowing what the state of the funding is, because nothing in the federal government happens without money backing it. So having an understanding of where the programs you operate under are funded, what the funding levels are, and what the funding predictions for the next couple of years will be, gives you the ability to advocate for things to happen. Because right now there's a lot of push for regulating AI. And there's a lot of discussions about rules around AI. But without money to enforce those rules, it's just going to be the honor code, which is what exists right now. So having an understanding of federal funding allows you to kind of like see into the future, because something must first be funded before it can happen. And having an idea of what is going to happen allows you to anticipate a lot of funding calls, political priorities, and new opportunities that researchers can really like tap into and be ahead of the curve of those who ignore the budgetary data.
I'll read Matthew's question, follow-up question. Could I ask for some clarification? Did you say that special funding like the CHIPS and Science Act are not reflected in the overall R&D funding?
It is and it isn't. And that's one of the fun parts of the budget. It's confusing enough that I can spend my entire job on it. So CHIPS and Science was mostly authorization, which means it was the promise of funding. They can ask for. So in regular appropriations in my R&D tracker, I would then see their requests for that funding. So that part is in R&D funding. It is in everything I track. The Inflation Reduction Act, however, had a lot of direct appropriations, especially for DOE, the Department of Energy. So that would not be reflected in my appropriations tracker because it happened outside of the appropriations cycle. It is, however, tracked in the subsequent year's totals. So every spring, OMB, the Office of Management and Budget at the White House, puts out an estimate of how much basic, applied, developmental, and construction of research facilities work is done. And all of the funding, regardless of if it was an appropriation in a supplemental or in an outside of appropriations legislative bill, will be included in those. So in real time, we may not see it, but the next year, we know exactly how much R&D was spent across the entirety of the federal budget, not just narrowly the appropriation cycle. So there's a bit of a lag when it exists outside, but we still do eventually add it up into the tally.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I'll turn the time back to Erin.
Sorry, took me a moment to find my unmute button. Thank you, Megan and Alessandra, for your presentations. Those were very interesting. I have lots of things to think about now. So, oh, it's still, anyway, there was still a thing on my screen that I'm recording on. It'll be fine. Thanks to Dan for helping out with the Q&A. And thanks to everyone that attended. Also, thanks to anyone that's watching this recording when it gets posted. This concludes our annual update. We'll be back next year with another one, so look forward to that.
Thank you so much for having us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Great questions. Take care, everybody. Bye.